Trade Union Federation Cosatu has welcomed South Africa's efforts to garner support from US President Joe Biden's administration for the renewal of the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act. The AGOA legislation was approved by the US Congress back in May of 2000. It is a trade preference program that grants eligible sub-Saharan African countries a duty-free access to United States markets. I am joined now by Cosatu Parliamentary Coordinator Matthew Parks to discuss this matter further. Matthew, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. So the AGOA Forum in Washington, D.C. Was recently hailed as a success. From Cosatu's perspective, what were the key outcomes and achievements of the forum?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having us. Look, I think it's a success for us, not just simply because we just had a forum, but I think given how far we've traveled over the past 2 years, past 2 years, we witnessed that there were many calls for South Africa to be removed from AGOA. That was quite alarming to us because literally thousands of jobs in the mining, the manufacturing, the agricultural sectors depend upon the preferential tariff access that the AGOA gives to South Africa. And of course, it also has a huge impact upon neighboring states like Botswana, Lesotho, and other African countries. I think that has largely moved on. I think there's largely consensus in the US after extensive engagement by South Africa's government, business, and labor to say, look, we need to keep AGOA, but we shouldn't just be keeping it and including South Africa and other African countries in it. We should be actually seeing how can we enhance it, how can we strengthen it, because it hasn't always reached its full potential. And given the huge unemployment rate in South Africa and a huge potential, given the real poverty issues, the underdevelopment Africa too, we need to do much, much better. We're also quite pleased that the discussion has really shifted to how can a new AGOA be strengthened? And there's been bipartisan support from both political parties in the US, both the Republicans and the Democrats, which is critical because US politics is always a 50-50 game. And there's also been a very firm commitment by our colleagues in the US to having fair labor practices, workers' rights, sustainable economic development being elevated and being enhanced as well. And I think for us, it's also critical as a trade union movement because you don't want to just simply rush to get investment and then people treat workers little better than slaves. They exploit them, they abuse their rights, they undermine trade unions' collective bargaining. So I think we do welcome an approach which says trade should also be partnered with respecting workers' rights and fair labor practices. And we should have a way of dealing with those countries, those employers who abuse workers. I think for us, that's a critical thing. And we're quite pleased that we've got organized labor being part of these discussions. So as part of the South African delegation and as part of the overall conference, there was organized labor from South Africa, from across Africa, from our colleagues in the US as well. And I think we're also quite pleased by how there's a common, united position as organized labor between our two continents. And I think for us, that's a critical thing as well.
So Cosatu has expressed strong support for extending and even enhancing AGOA. Can you elaborate on the specific enhancements that you're advocating for here and how they would impact South Africa's workers and industry as well?
So I think first, number one is about making sure that a workers' agenda is firmly on the table. So that respecting workers' rights, fair labor practices is firmly part of it. That when reviews are done of countries' eligibility and so forth, and when there's interventions to deal with offending companies, that organized labor be part of those discussions as well. We don't want it just simply to be a government-to-government issue, but that workers' voice must be firmly heard at all times. There's also a need to enhance the scope of goods covered by it. It's been tended to be dominated by petroleum, by mineral exports from many African countries. We need to really go far, far beyond that. We need to look at other products as well. We don't want to see a simply a narrow protectionist approach at times, the way I understand the politics of that. So I think the second issue about extending the scope of goods covered. Also, the third issue is about, if you look at many of the African countries, the amount of trade they've done under AGOA to the US has actually not been very impressive. Some of it is quite minimal. And often an issue is about access to finance, access to roads, to electricity, to water, about railways working, about the ports being efficient, etc. So we do need to see what support can be given to complement AGOA, to give more support towards capital, towards network support for African emerging sectors as well. Because there's no point of having a nice agreement on paper, but if the farmer in Central African Republic or the manufacturer in Mozambique can't take advantage of it, doesn't even know about it or how to access it, then it's not going to reach its full potential. So I think for us, it's about a holistic package and really see how we can do it to make it much smarter, because Africa's economic potential is falling far behind the rest of the world, and that has an impact upon South Africa. South Africa can't be an island of prosperity, so to speak, in a sea of poverty. We've got to see the rest of the continent's development taking place as well. Otherwise, we're going to be overwhelmed by migration, by workers who are desperately looking for jobs.
Matthew, given the current geopolitical climate and also concerns about South Africa's foreign policy stance, how does Cosatu then plan to address potential opposition or even challenges from US policymakers regarding the AGOA?
Yeah, I think, look, we understand politics. Politics is always a bit of a rough place. I think we've had good learning experience as South Africa, and I think also with our colleagues in the US over the past years through extensive engagements. The Russia-Ukraine conflict was quite a difficult moment in our relations. I think we've managed to see how to manage that, how to circumnavigate it, because right now you also have the onslaught by Israel against the people of Palestine, especially in Gaza Strip. So you are always going to have some sort of geopolitical turbulence. I think the point is that we shouldn't allow our trade relations with other countries to collapse because of that, because we don't control what happens in Ukraine, we don't control what happens in Palestine, and wherever other future conflicts might arise. So we need to de-link the trade from the politics a bit. I think there's been a growing appreciation of that position by the colleagues in the US, and to find ways to address our relationships. And I think we also need to make sure that whilst we strengthen our relation with the US, we also do likewise with other key trading partners too, like the European Union, like China, like India, like the BRICS partners, and of course, most strategically with the African continent too, where ultimately our future and our potential lies. And that includes enhancing and expediting the African continental free trade area as well, because you can't be overly exposed to one market. There's always going to be fluctuations, which might be geopolitical. They could also be related to economic crisis. They could be related to natural disasters as well, crop disease and so forth. So you need to always, extend your relationships. And again, when we have a 42% unemployment rate in South Africa, we should actually be seeking how to exploit and enhance every single trade and export opportunity, not just be simply content to the status quo. So I think we have seen positive progress in that regard with the relationship with the US. And I think also equally, I think there's an appreciation which needs to be strengthened about respecting South Africa's sovereignty. We are an independent sovereign nation. We have a history of being non-aligned, of trying to be on good terms with all countries across the world, but also giving solidarity to struggling nations, whether it's Israel, Palestine, sorry, not Israel, whether it's Palestine or Western Sahara or Cuba, etc. So I think there is a need for other parties to appreciate that too, but I think we have made significant progress. Not out of the woods yet, but I think there is good potential for renewing AGOA. And I think we've received from our US colleagues a clear commitment that AGOA will be renewed. We're hoping to get it expedited so it's renewed before next year. And I think there is a clear commitment to understand South Africa as an economic anchor, so to speak, in Africa, would be part of that journey, and organized labor too as well. So I think for us there's been positive progress on that front.
With the considerations that you highlight, how do you respond to critics who argue that AGOA's benefits are not evenly distributed and that it might not significantly address the unemployment issues in South Africa?
No, look, that's the key point. We have a good agreement on paper where the US, basically the largest economy in the world currently, has lifted tariff access for African exports, including South Africans. We have to make sure we take full advantage of that, because we can't be content with our levels of poverty and inequality in South Africa, with our levels of high unemployment, etc., a weak economy. We've got to do much better. And we also can't be complacent when we see other African countries struggling. 50 years, 60 years of independence, not having made significant inroads and progress. So we've got to see, we can't be happy with the status quo. How do we improve it? How do we enhance it? And how do we really give support for African emerging sectors to take advantage of that? I think for us, if we were to continue on the status quo, well, then we shouldn't be surprised when we get the same results. So we've got to be much more creative and bold. And that means the US colleagues too also should be saying, how can they support African countries to modernize the ports? And I think there's been $1 billion investment in Angola and the Lobito corridor, which would be key to Angola, a country with huge potential, and also to benefit Zambia as well, which historically has struggled because of a lack of access to ports and so forth. And again, as South Africans, we also have to make sure we address our own issues of ensuring reliable and affordable electricity, of fixing our transit freight rail, modernizing our ports, dealing with the issues of municipal services, but also giving support financially to emerging sectors too. And we also have to have a fairer approach to paying workers a living wage. The tendency of capital to simply pay workers a slave wage, and they're wondering why we remain impoverished, that philosophy has to be collapsed once and for all.
Matthew, looking beyond AGOA, What other trade or economic policy should South Africa pursue to indeed diversify its trade partnerships, but also strengthen its economic position globally as well?
So right now there is discussions that will be taking place quite soon around with the European Union on the economic preferential area. That's key because the European Union again is one of our major trading partners, and the EU often has tended to take quite harsh, excessively protectionist positions with regards to South African exports. And we've seen it time and again with regards to the citrus industry. That has an impact upon jobs in the Western Cape and in the farming sector and so forth. So we need to kind of address those issues. They are quite technical and quite complicated.
Yeah. We're
part of BRICS, but we also need to say how to enhance our trade relationship with all members of the BRICS parties, from Brazil to Russia to India, China. And again, China is one of our major trading partners. How do we exploit that? How do we ramp it up? Ultimately, we also have to say our future lies with Africa. Politically, economically, neighboring states, migration, all of that. And South Africa is not going to grow at a sustainable pace if neighboring states are languishing in poverty. So we really need to make sure we accelerate the implementation of the African Free Trade Continental Agreement, because South Africa can't grow if Zimbabwe is bleeding, if Mozambique is struggling because of terrorism in northern Mozambique, if the DRC remains hobbled by infrastructure underdevelopment, etc. So I think for us, these things must complement that. And one of the nice things about AGOA is that if you look at Botswana and Lesotho, for example, the exports to the US are quite small, and actually pale into insignificance when you compare Botswana and Lesotho's exports to South Africa, and those parts, whether it's wire harnessing from Botswana, whether it's the seats for cars, they are then included in South African factories in cars, which are then exported to the US as well. So we need to make sure that these trade agreements with the US, with Europe, other countries and continents complement Africa's regional integration. They can do so, then that really will be a win-win scenario, because we simply can't afford to leave other African countries behind at any point.
Cosatu's Matthew Parks, thank you for sharing your insights and perspectives on AGOA, but also the implications for South Africa.